بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه الطاهرين ما داموا في السماوات والأرضين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم إنا نسألك علما ينفعنا اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا ورزقا واسعا وعملا متقبلا وشفاء من كل داء. وبعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. MashaAllah, it's lovely to see all of the familiar faces. And I want to ask a big maaf for those brothers who have been dodging from last year's Itikaf till this year's Itikaf. And the missed calls is not my fault, that's the phone's fault. Inshallah. But a few of the brothers have outstanding questions. I got the answer to the question also, but I just need to tell you the answer. Inshallah. So after the dars, inshallah, any of those questions that I didn't answer, inshallah, we'll tackle them just to fulfill the amana, inshallah. So we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for affording us this opportunity for our i'tikaf. And irrespective of whether we are making the full i'tikaf or we're making i'tikaf in part, ma la yudrakul kull la yudrakul kull. Whatever we cannot do in its entirety, we don't also leave off in its entirety. So even if we're just popping in and popping out, very importantly, when we come into the masjid, we make the intention, nawaitul i'tikaf adumtu fil masjid. I make an intention of i'tikaf, of spiritual seclusion for as long as I am in the masjid. And we also remind ourselves that the i'tikaf, Ahmed, I was touching your mouth from last year. Because it distracts me when I'm talking, and I'm thinking Ahmed is looking for me, and there's no way I can dodge him now because he's right in front of me. So we find the Prophet ﷺ, he had i'tikaf, was sunnah mu'akkada. Sunnah mu'akkada, we know sunnah generally is, if you do it, you reward it. If you omit it, then there's no punishment. Which is very important and significant to understand. But there's a sunnah mu'akkada, which means despite the fact it was recommended, the Prophet ﷺ would never omit it, never leave it off. So whenever the Prophet ﷺ had an opportunity to perform i'tikaf in terms of Ramadan, he would perform i'tikaf. The only reason he would not be performing i'tikaf was when he was out on jihad and it is something preoccupied him of a greater importance, of an obligation that the Prophet ﷺ need to be fulfilled, otherwise he would be in i'tikaf. So we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this beautiful opportunity, particularly in the last 10 nights. And irrespective, I did something very beautiful, doing its rounds on the social media, but I think it's very beautiful. Many of us, when we enter into the last 10 nights, we base it on our experience in the first 20 days. So if it was good, that's a good platform, and then we prepare ourselves into the last 10 nights. That's one way of looking at it. And if you fall into that category, mashallah, good and well. But if you fall into the latter category, like many of us, that the first 20 days didn't really work out as planned. I could have done much better. I could have fasted better. I could have prayed better. I could have spent more time with the Quran and so forth. Then, not to despair. And this is the most important part of the month of Ramadan. So whatever may have happened in terms of our negligence, in terms of fasting and praying, we have this golden opportunity now in the form of the last 10 days. And like the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالْخَوَاتِيمِ, actions are judged by the endings. And perhaps also there's a beautiful lesson. A person who feels that he's in a good position, because his first 20 days was filled with good acts of worship, and now he's in a good position for the last 10 days, is equal to the person who feels that he's done nothing, and therefore is not in a good position. And what's the commonality between the two? That both are placing reliance on their actions, and not placing reliance on Allah. So the person who feels in a good way is relying on his actions. The person who doesn't feel in a good way is relying on non-actions. In both, they're not relying upon Allah. So whether we're doing these or not doing these, the ultimate focal point and one of the realizations that we must come to is that ultimately we must place our reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our focus and our objective must be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah grant us the understanding. The topic that discussing would be paradigms of leadership. And I was inspired, or rather we as a collective were inspired by one of our teachers having a lecture series on the paradigms of leadership. So the course is basically broken into two things. One is basically just looking at the phenomenon of leadership, the concept of leadership, and our appreciation of that particular concept. And then looking at luminaries, this 1400-year-old history, looking at luminaries and see how they practically manifested these leadership qualities. So that's the purpose, inshallah, of the course. And in the interim, in terms of the source material that I'm gaining from, there's a lot of methodological things that need to be considered. There's a lot of, perhaps if you want to go, ideological things that we need to look at. And I'm hoping, as I benefited in the process of preparing for the lesson, I'm hoping to share that benefit with you, inshallah, and to optimize that benefit, because knowledge is between two, So as always, my preference in terms of having discussion, particularly this discussion, is to have an engagement. I would mention something, and I wouldn't say a discussion, but for us to actively engage with the concepts that we are speaking about. And if you have a question or a comment or a thought, please feel free to engage with us. So the first phenomenon we're going to be looking at, we're really going to be looking at the term leadership. And when we think about leadership, we think about the Prophet ﷺ. He was the ultimate leader. And if you want to look at or you have to measure the success of a leader, you're going to have to look at his constituency. So what constituency did the Prophet ﷺ leave behind? He left behind the companions and the successors and the successors of the successors. So from their perspective, if you look at the leadership of the Prophet ﷺ, then you're going to consider it to be an overwhelming success. It is very much like a classroom type of situation, where if you want to measure the success of the teacher, you're not going to look how well he's teaching. You're going to have to look how well the students are learning. And that's how you basically measure. So the Prophet ﷺ, without a doubt, he was a successful leader. And he managed to, if you look at the Arabs, basically in terms of the Arabs, before the advent of Islam and the leadership of the Prophet ﷺ, the Arabs, they were pagan people. But after they were pagan, they were worshipping idols. They became religious. And then they were disunited. And the anecdotes there are endless in terms of the disunity amongst the Arabs. But then they became a united people. They did not, of everything, they did not believe in life after death. But then the entire existence became only about life after death. So this transformation that happened to the Arabs, it happened through the leadership of the Prophet. So just to repeat, they were disunited, they became united. They were pagan, they became religious. They weren't concerned, they didn't believe really in life after death. Of all the phenomena, that's why when Allah refers to life after death, you would say, in the year after they have certainty. So certainty comes about when you have doubt and you have issues regarding a certain phenomenon. Once you resolve those issues, now you come to a certainty regarding it. So Allah doesn't say they believe in the year after. Allah says they come to a certainty regarding the year after. So they didn't believe in the year after initially, but then they came to be preoccupied in everything they did. They only did for the year after. So how did that happen? That happened through the Prophet. But the leadership of the Prophet was, very importantly, there was a divine agency in it. So in other words, if you were to refer to the Arabs as an about turn happened through the leadership of the Prophet, we ask the question, how did this happen? We're going to say from the outset, or rather what we're not going to say it was the brilliance of the Prophet. It's important to understand from the outset. We're not going to say it's the brilliance of the Prophet. We're not going to say that. But we're going to say it is because of the divine agency. It is because of the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's how this particular transformation came about. But then, yes, it's through the divine agency, but we live in a world of cause and effect. We live in a world of cause and effect. What our scholars refer to as linearities. We have a cause and effect, for example, the fire burns. So we live in a linear world of cause and effect. So when we look at the leadership of the Prophet ﷺ now, and we admit to the divine agency, but at the same time we were to ask our question, what was it that made the Prophet ﷺ such a brilliant leader, which resulted in this about term in terms of the Arabs, and then they became the rulers and the developers of what we know today to be the civilized world. So what were those particular causes? Because the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't only come in terms of connecting the creation to the Creator. That's one purpose. Another purpose side to that was to provide leadership. The Prophet ﷺ, so what was the causes? وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. That if you were hard-hearted and harsh, then they would have dispersed from you. In other words, so part of his leadership manner was that they had a character that could encompass people as opposed to chasing them away. So when we look at the leadership of the Prophet ﷺ, now we want to explore certain of these phenomena. In other words, what manly virtues did he possess that made him this great leader? And Allah SWT knows best. Now this is the very important thing that I learned in this particular series, on which our interaction is based upon, and that is, we find that Western writers, when they look at the Prophet ﷺ, and we're very enthused about this. For example, when we find that there's a non-Muslim, like a Western writer, he talks about the most influential people in the world, and then the Prophet ﷺ comes on top of that list, we're very enthused thereby. There's another book by John Adair, and the name of that book is The Leadership of Muhammad. And in there basically discusses the leadership qualities of the Prophet ﷺ, by means of which we find that about them in terms of the Arabs and the success that we now witness to be Islam. So many Western writers has actually taken the leadership of the Prophet ﷺ as a secular model. Secular model means that you basically racket out the divine agency. You take it out of the equation. You leave the divine agency outside. And you say that the success of the Prophet ﷺ as a leader was because of these qualities and the list of qualities. And that's how non-Muslim writers, they use the Prophet ﷺ as a leadership example, not within an Islamic paradigm, within a very secular paradigm. And that is very problematic for us. Because the Prophet ﷺ was everything what they say, but he was everything what they say due to the divine agency. And so it's very important for us to be quite familiar with this, and Allah SWT knows best. Then, when we look at the phenomenon of leadership, we're going to discuss a few leaders, but it's important for us to have a good understanding of the term leadership. And then just look at terminology in general. I don't know if I can maybe give an extraneous example about terminology. You know that our Islam is Arabic. Why? Because we believe in a revealed religion, revelation. That revealed religion takes on the form of Arabic. So in other words, our religion is Arabic in terms of its word, it's also Arabic in terms of its meaning. I'm looking at Uncle Nazim now. I remember on one occasion they asked me on the radio, and Uncle Nazim happened to be listening in. They asked me, what does the Quran say about hitting a woman in Islam? In other words, domestic violence or not domestic violence. I responded like, sort of like, I'm serious about it, but it actually comes across relatively funny. Because I said, there's no place in the Quran where the word hitting is mentioned. What I meant thereby is that the Quran is Arabic. in the word and in the meaning. So the word it, I didn't see, and I didn't hear Khufar, Bacha, or anybody, I didn't, you know, you will. So you understand it's true. But then you say, okay, don't be technical. I'm not saying that the word hit, I'm saying the meaning. And that's the lesson we must learn today. That the Quran talks about darb, yes, but we must be careful when we take the word darb and we give an equivalent to that particular thought that belongs to a different thought world. The transmutation from our thought world to another thought world, we must be very careful about that. So leadership is used as an example. So let's give a few other examples, just to understand this idea. So we talk about the Prophet ﷺ, and when we refer to him in the English language, the English language represents an Anglo-Saxon thought world. Now in English, when you refer to the Nabi, or when you refer to the Rasul, what do you say? You say Prophet. Is Prophet and Nabi the same thing? You're going to say yes, but not quite. Because there's the word Nabi, if you understand the semantics about Nabi, and you understand the semantics about Prophet, yes, it's a suitable translation, but they're not quite the same thing. Another example which our scholars give is you use the word, so you're a believer, so you have faith. Even we use the word believer, like I'm a believer. But in Arabic, the term is mu'min. So the semantics of believer and the semantics of mu'min, yes, it's correct, but not quite the same. Actually, if you study the word believer, Wallahu a'lam, just since we're on the topic also, to say I'm a believer, my understanding of the word believe in terms of its etymology and where it comes from, it's an exact translation of the word iman. So you can feel very comfortable saying that I'm a believer. Because believe, the B is like a prefix, and leave basically means to place your trust. And iman means tasdeeq. What does iman mean? Tasdeeq bima ja'a bi Rasul. I believe to be true, I trust to be true that which the Prophet quote. He told us it is Malaika, he told us it is Allah, he told us it is whatever, fourth part of our Aqidah. So when I say, Ana uminu bi, and I say I believe in him, is one of the examples that it's exactly the same, despite the fact that you're using a different language to express the same reality. That's also possible. You can use a different language to express that reality on point. You can do that. But when it comes to English, you need to be circumspect, you need to be very careful. Because what is meant by that word in English may not necessarily be what is meant by that word in terms of Arabic. Maybe to make things easier, Surah Yusuf, all of us we love Surah Yusuf, it's a complete story, it's very nice. So Yusuf alayhi salam, he says, I saw the dream, I saw 11 stars, and I saw the sun and the moon, I saw them all prostrating towards me. Now, in terms of the verse, what is that? That's Arabic. Yusuf alayhi salam didn't speak Arabic. He says, Ra'aytu li sajin, I saw them prostrating to me. He didn't say those verbatim words because he didn't speak Arabic. He was from Bani Israel. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the exact meaning of what was conveyed in the native tongue of Yusuf alayhi salam, Allah expresses that exact meaning in Arabic. So there's no discrepancy. So in other words, is it possible that you come from one language and you have another language that you can express that exact meaning using another language? This is possible. But when it comes to English, it's a different story altogether. Why? Because of the semantic dynamics and the connotation that certain English words have. So those are all extraneous examples. Our point of discussion currently is leadership. So what does leadership mean? If you're going to a leadership workshop or seminar, what are we talking about when you use the word leadership? So we said now that the term leadership is an English term, and it's very much representative of English word is called the Western word, so it's very much representative in terms of Western thought. Now, what is the Western thought when it comes to leadership? You have a thought Western thought, what is it all about? The West that we live in, and this is very important for us to understand, and unfortunately we don't have much dialogue in this particular regard. Would you agree with me if I said to you that modernity, particularly South Africa, if you wanted to, particularly Cape Town, we were given opportunity to travel to Palestine. So we went to the West Bank and visited one of my friends there. So his family, they're Palestinian, but they were in America, and sort of like they moved between America and Palestine. So the family was with. So my friend's daughters wanted to know from my daughters if we have lions in the backyard. You know, there's this perception of Africa. But if you hear in Africa, you know that it's not like that. Yes, there are lions, but maybe you say lions of a different nature, but whatever you want to say. So if you look at, I'm asking about the question about modernity. So you know, as South Africans in Cape Town, it's almost like in terms of infrastructure to a large degree. Yes, we have a number of challenges, but infrastructure in South Africa to a large degree very much resembles Western infrastructure, like a European country. And even in South Africa, they say that Cape Town, people who come from other parts of the country, basically in terms of, I think, basic services and so forth, they almost like say it's like the Europe of South Africa. So would you agree with me that we stay in a modern city? We stay in a modern city. So that leads to the statement that modernity is our context. We live in a modern context. But what can very well happen if we're not familiar and conscious of this particular fact, then as opposed to modernity just being our context, modernity becomes our excuse. And I think this is a very important phrase that I want you to hold on to. Modernity is our context, it is not our excuse. So, for example, a modern phenomenon based on modern liberalism, you have, for example, LGBTQ plus. Is that the context that we live in? Yes. If your kids are at school, Weinberg boys, Weinberg girls, whatever the case may be, they're going to be exposed to LGBTQ, equality, gender neutral, all of those type of things. That is the context, undeniably. But can that become your excuse? No. So for us, very importantly, all phenomena that we deal with, we must understand the context of it. But it mustn't become an excuse. So when we talk about leadership in our context, what does it mean? Leadership, you go to a leadership workshop, all they basically telling you is how you can basically get on top of the corporate ladder. That's a leadership phenomenon. There's an argument that so we want to create, in the modern context, we wanted to create equality, not only in terms of opportunity, but we want to create equality in terms of outcome as well. So if there's a list of, this is the amount of male CEOs, we want to get the same amount of female CEOs. So if a lady goes to a leadership workshop, they will teach her how to climb the corporate ladder and get on top. In other words, they will emasculate her somehow, because you need to get certain male qualities into you, in order for you to reach the top. So that's like a form of leadership that we talk about. Leadership, in many instances, how you can get a job, how you can get a salary increase, all of those type of things. So when we use the word leadership within an Islamic paradigm, you can't take the leadership that you find in your modern context and cut and paste that and say we're talking about the same thing, because we're not talking about the same thing. And the unique thing, if you really think about it, is just an example for everything else. Every other concept that you have, we must be very wary of taking a concept which has an application in a modern context, cutting and pasting it into an Islamic thought world. It doesn't work like that. The examples I give you don't necessarily have to agree, and you may have to do maybe some research to ascertain whether you actually agree with me or not. But I'll give you another example of you being in a modern context, and then you take the modern context and then you apply it to an Islamic paradigm. So you find that there's an issue of equal opportunities for men and women in the workplace. You find that. So now you say equality within the workplace, that is 100%. Then you take that concept, you cut it from the modern context, and you place it within an Islamic paradigm, and you say, we also fight for equal opportunities for women in the workplace. Not realizing that when you move from the modern context into the Islamic context, you're talking about equal opportunities for women in the workplace. Within an Islamic context, there's no women in the workplace in the first place. You with me? ليس من دأب الرجال ضرب الأمثال. Don't knock me in terms of the example. I'm only using the example to facilitate the understanding. Now you can get yourself into a pickle when the transposition from one framework to another framework. Okay, this is really the main part of today's talk, because after this point we can, that's the main point. Modern context and Islamic context. If this is not the reality, what then does the Prophet mean by saying الدين بدأ غريبا وسيعود غريبا? That Islam started in a strange way and it's going to end up being strange, going to be different. You don't want to be different, but you can't be the same. That's what Sheikh Ismail regularly says. So the important part is that we must understand our context and then be very careful when we find ourselves in the Western thought world and things work in a particular way, but then we want to import things that are actually alien to our thought world. We want to transplant that from a Western thought world into an Islamic thought world. We shouldn't be doing that. And yeah, uniquely, I would never thought about it. This is our teachers and discuss it, but I wouldn't have thought of leadership as such a thing. If I talk to you about leadership, you say, yes, we need leadership. Can we have a leadership workshop in Masjid? Yes, we should. We need more leaders, and we find that Islamic institutions mushrooming all over the place. What are we doing? We're producing leaders. What leaders are you producing? Leaders along the Western line of leaders, or along the Islamic line of leaders. So that is the important question that we need to look at with ourselves. So here is a bit of, and so is everybody okay with the concept? You understand? If you have a question, you can ask me. So the human being we're talking about leadership. So naturally, you're going to find that amongst humans, you're going to have a leader. You can have a leader. But now within the Western paradigm, what's going to happen? The West views the human being in a particular manner. And this is one of the greatest challenges of modernity. Because the Western philosophy, if you wanted to, they view the human being as completely autonomous. In other words, the human being is a law unto himself or herself. And sometimes, perhaps just to sort of relate it to our understanding, is that somebody West views the human being as autonomous. He is an authority unto himself. They refer to it as humanism, whereby the human being, myself, I'm deified. And sometimes it comes across when somebody tells you something, but you're autonomous, so you tell him, be here for me to say. No, but Allah says, and I said, no, be here for me to say. So we become autonomous. And when you become autonomous, you actually considering yourself as autonomous is alien to Islam, because Islam means submission. You're not submitting, you're submitting to the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if a person considers himself autonomous and then he develops submission issues, he's unable to submit, that is a product of Western ideology, not a product of an Islamic ideology. Islamic ideology would be sami'na wa ta'ana. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands, we hear and we obey. So this idea of humanism considers the human being, considers him very much to be a law unto himself. And this human being is continuously progressing, and he's continuously becoming a better version of himself as he propels himself into the future. So now what happens is, if you take leadership and you plug it into this particular context, you know exactly what we mean about a leadership in that particular context. Uh, our scholars, Quran puts it very nice. What happens? Ya ayyuhan nasu innama baghyukum ala anfusikum. You have this experience in terms of, I'm not talking about leadership in terms of the paper that they give out at the conference. I'm talking about every day when you go into the boardroom and the dynamics, the power plays, in terms of board members and in terms of employers and all of that. Allah talks about Ya ayyuhan nasu innama baghyukum ala anfusikum. You have a desire to go up, but many times the desire to go up is at the expense of somebody below you. So you have to tap on the person's head, the rung below you, in order for you to propel yourself up. Allah not to say, this type of desire that leads you to transgress against others in order for you to achieve things. That type of thing is not, that type of leadership is not within an Islamic paradigm. But the point being that if you have this view of a human being, that this is the human being, he just, no matter what, at the cost of, he's just on a forward momentum in terms of his material gain, then you find that leadership in that particular context is going to be very different from leadership within an Islamic paradigm. And then you come now to the leadership of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So the first thing what we say is not his standalone qualities that caused him to become a leader, but rather there was the divine agency within that particular equation, which actually led to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam becoming the leader that he was in terms of those qualities. So for the deciding leader, when he looks to the seerah of the Prophet Sallallahu, what does he find? Yes, he finds all of these leadership qualities. He finds them all in the role that the Prophet had. Of course, he had to have it. He had to have charisma. And this reminds one, in Quran, you find that Allah SWT mentions many individuals that has charisma. And if you wanted to, the way I understood it was, charisma is an intangible thing. You can't really put your finger onto it. You can understand almost like a radio activity. And what does this radio activity do? It draws people to you. But you have two types of this charisma, radio activity. You have like the spiritual one, like the Prophet who necessarily have to have in order to draw people towards him. But then you also find a very negative one, and that is like a material one. And that would be, and in the Quran you find these archetypes. For example, Musa and Fir'aun. Musa was a leader in his own right, but he was a leader in the Islamic paradigm of leadership. And then Fir'aun was a leader, but not in the Islamic paradigm of things. So both of them had charisma, but the one was spiritual, but the other one was one of ego. So you find that, so in order for the Prophet to be a leader, he had to have these manly virtues, bravery, charisma. He had to have generalship qualities. He had to have leadership qualities and all of those. But what do we find? We find at the same time the Prophet also had certain qualities which we stereotypically refer to as almost like feminine qualities. The Prophet also, before the Battle of Badr, was crying. I mean, I'm just asking now genuinely out of, what would your knee-jerk reaction be if we were going to jihad tomorrow, right? And our Amir, he's crying. Let's just say you don't know the reason he's crying. He's not like the most pious guy, but he's jumping. What do you think? We must change the Amir? Because we'll tell him, if you want to cry, then cry in your tent. Not here in front of everybody, you're gonna, that just came to my mind in terms of, so here you have this lead. And the evil battle battle 330, they're going to conquer 1,000 strong, well-equipped soldiers. This is the ultimately culminating fight from Makkah. And the night before, you find the Prophet standing in prayers. What do we see there? The Prophet crying. When they would describe the Prophet, or what do they describe him as? They say that كان أشد حياء من البكر في خدرها. The Prophet in terms of haya, in terms of bashfulness, they say he was more shy than a virgin girl in a tent. In other words, a virgin girl who's never left the home. How will I explain that? All of us, and women in particular, have two types of modesty. One is an innate modesty that one has, and then the other one is the Sharia modesty. So now you find a lady that she hasn't left the home. So she has a natural modesty with her. And because she's a virgin girl, she still has that natural modesty that you can. and not that it's a bad thing, but if a lady gets married and actually interacts with her husband, then part of that shyness automatically goes away because you're engaging in physical intimacy. So they say the Prophet ﷺ, he was more bashful and more shy than a virgin girl within the tent. So again, when we think about leadership, and we think about the qualities that pop up, we don't think about these qualities. So the Prophet had those qualities as well. So the scholars are, so then how did he become this great leader? And it basically comes to one very simple thing. Inshallah, we'll end on a particular note, and tomorrow I'll produce all the ahadith, inshallah, regarding just leadership, and then we'll start mentioning, or we'll look at some individuals and the Bahari doctrine in particular regard. So what was the Prophet? What was it all about? The Prophet ﷺ, he was given leadership without coveting leadership, without seeking leadership. He was of the world, but was not seeking the world. And this would really be sort of defining, the leadership of the Prophet ﷺ. So we'll end on that note, inshallah, and tomorrow there are many hadith, inshallah, which I will mention from Fath al-Bari, that talks about how you and I as Muslims, when we look at leadership, so you might be the leader of your company, you might be the leader of your household, you might be a leader in different capacities. How does Islam view that leadership, and what qualities does it expect you to have in order to fulfill that role of leadership? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the tawfiq. جزاكم الله خيرا وبارك الله فيكم جميعا. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.